The African continent has long been a stage for both extraordinary resilience and overwhelming challenges. Among the most pressing of these is the scourge of terrorism, a shadow that has claimed countless lives, disrupted economies, and destabilized entire regions. Yet, in the heart of West Africa, a dramatic new chapter is being written. Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fiery leader of Burkina Faso, has declared what many are already calling the most decisive and ambitious military move in Africa's modern history, a full-scale war on terror that could reshape the continent's future. This announcement has reverberated far beyond Ouagadougou, igniting debates in global capitals, shaking military alliances, and challenging the entrenched order of international power. What Traoré has undertaken is not simply another counterinsurgency. It is a reimagining of Africa's capacity to secure itself, led by a leader who refuses to bow to either Western dictates or extremist threats. To understand the magnitude of this development, one must first appreciate the broader context. Burkina Faso has endured relentless assaults from terrorist groups linked to al-Qaeda and ISIS, particularly in its northern and eastern provinces. Entire villages have been razed, thousands displaced, and national cohesion stretched to the breaking point. For years, the response to this escalating violence had been hampered by limited resources, outdated equipment, and over-reliance on foreign powers who often acted with their own geopolitical agendas. French forces, for example, were deployed across the Sahel under the banner of Operation Barkhane. Yet the outcomes of these interventions left many African nations questioning whether the West's presence alleviated the problem or deepened it. Traoré's rise to power marked a decisive rejection of dependency and a bold assertion that Africa must forge its own path toward security. From the very beginning of his leadership, Traoré made it clear that his fight was not just for Burkina Faso, but for the dignity of all Africans. His fiery speeches often invoked the memory of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary icon, and drew inspiration from Pan-African ideals. By declaring an outright war on terror, he has escalated the struggle to a continental stage, insisting that Africa must unite its strength, consolidate its resources, and demonstrate to the world that it is no longer a passive victim of global conflicts, but an active architect of its destiny. This is not just a battle against insurgents in remote deserts. It is a confrontation with the structures that have allowed terrorism to thrive in Africa for decades. Poverty, external manipulation, weak governance, and fractured solidarity among African nations. The scope of Traoré's declaration is immense. Reports indicate that Burkina Faso has mobilized tens of thousands of troops, reservists, and volunteers in what is described as the largest military mobilization in its history. Villagers are being trained in defense tactics, youth are joining volunteer brigades, and new alliances are being forged with neighboring countries such as Mali and Niger. Together, these nations form what is increasingly being referred to as a new Sahelian Defense Pact, a coalition independent of Western control, rooted in mutual survival and regional sovereignty. Unlike past joint operations that were often dictated by foreign advisors, this alliance reflects an African-led initiative, emphasizing shared intelligence, synchronized operations, and pooled resources. Traoré has even hinted at the establishment of an African defense industry, capable of producing its own arms, drones, and vehicles to avoid dependence on imports that often come with strings attached. Critics in the West are quick to warn of overreach. They argue that Burkina Faso lacks the financial and technological muscle to sustain such a campaign. But Traoré counters this skepticism with unflinching conviction. He points to the determination of the people, the natural resources that can fund security initiatives, and the rising wave of Pan-African solidarity that refuses to tolerate subjugation any longer. Indeed, his declaration of war on terror has galvanized populations across the continent, with young Africans in Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, and even as far as South Africa echoing calls for their leaders to adopt similar stances of defiance and independence. For many, Traoré has become the face of a new African awakening, uncompromising, youthful, and unwilling to negotiate with forces that undermine the continent's sovereignty. The military strategy itself is both conventional and unconventional. On one hand, Burkina Faso is reinforcing its borders, fortifying key cities, and conducting targeted strikes against militant hideouts in the Sahel's vast terrain. On the other, it is embracing asymmetrical warfare tactics, using drones for surveillance, training local militias in guerrilla tactics, and leveraging community intelligence to root out infiltrators. This blend of state-led and people-driven defense marks a departure from past strategies that relied heavily on foreign command structures. In Traoré's vision, every citizen has a role to play, whether as a soldier, a provider of intelligence, or a supporter of logistical operations. Equally significant is the ideological component of this war. Traoré has been vocal about the necessity of countering not only the physical presence of terrorists, but also the narratives that sustain them. He insists that Africa's youth must be shielded from extremist propaganda by offering them alternative visions of dignity, purpose, and prosperity. Education, job creation, and cultural pride form a critical flank of his campaign. For Traoré, defeating terror means more than eliminating fighters. It means dismantling the ecosystem of despair and manipulation that fuels radicalization. In this sense, the war is as much social and political as it is military. Yet the boldness of this initiative has not come without risks. Already there are reports of intensified attacks by terrorist groups seeking to undermine morale and demonstrate resilience. International organizations have voiced concern over human rights violations, warning that such an expansive campaign may inadvertently harm civilians or exacerbate existing tensions. Western powers, feeling sidelined, are exploring ways to pressure Traoré's government, whether through sanctions, economic isolation, or covert destabilization. Traoré himself acknowledges the dangers, often reminding his people that the path of sovereignty is never easy. He argues, however, that the alternative, subservience to foreign agendas and endless cycles of terror, is far more costly in the long run. The ripple effects of this war declaration are already visible on the geopolitical stage. Russia and China have expressed interest in supporting Burkina Faso, not merely with words, but with potential arms deals, infrastructure projects, and political backing at the United Nations. Meanwhile, France finds itself in an increasingly awkward position, its influence in West Africa rapidly eroding. The United States, too, is monitoring closely, torn between its desire to contain terrorism and its unease at losing strategic footholds in the region. For Africa, however, Traoré's defiance has sparked a broader question. Could this be the beginning of a Pan-African security framework that operates beyond the dictates of the West? Could this mark the dawn of an era where African nations no longer outsource their safety but build continental systems of defense and deterrence? The symbolism of Traoré's war on terror cannot be overstated. At just 36 years old, he represents a new generation of African leadership, unafraid to challenge old hierarchies, willing to experiment with unorthodox solutions, and deeply rooted in the struggles of ordinary people. His choice of words in recent speeches reveals not only a military leader, but also a visionary, determined to liberate his nation from dependency. He frames the war on terror as part of a larger war on exploitation, corruption, and neocolonialism. For him, the enemy is not only the armed extremist in the desert, but also the structures that allow Africa to remain weak and vulnerable. As the campaign unfolds, the world watches with a mixture of admiration, skepticism, and fear. Admiration from Africans who see in Traoré a rare courage to stand up against overwhelming odds. Skepticism from analysts who doubt Burkina Faso's capacity to sustain such an ambitious campaign. Fear from powers that recognize the potential consequences if his strategy succeeds. Seismic shift in Africa's geopolitical landscape. Where Western dominance is no longer guaranteed, the coming months and years will determine the true outcome of Traoré's bold gamble. If successful, Burkina Faso may not only neutralize the immediate terrorist threat, but also inspire a continental movement toward unity and sovereignty. If it falters, however, the consequences could be devastating, plunging the nation deeper into instability and emboldening extremist groups. Yet for now, one truth stands clear. Traoré has dared to do what few before him have attempted. He has declared war not only on terror, but on the very structures that perpetuate Africa's vulnerability. In doing so, he has placed himself at the forefront of history, a young leader carrying the weight of an entire continent's aspirations on his shoulders. This declaration is more than a military maneuver. It is a manifesto of resistance and hope. It challenges Africans to rethink their role in global affairs, to embrace the possibility of self-determination, and to recognize that the fight for security is inseparable from the fight for dignity. Ibrahim Traoré's war on terror is not only Africa's biggest military move yet, it is also one of its most profound political statements, a declaration that Africa will no longer wait for others to secure its future. Whether history remembers this as a triumph or a tragedy will depend not only on Traoré's leadership, but also on the willingness of Africans to rise to the challenge alongside him.